Thanks, everyone. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Hi, my name's Ashi, and today's talk has not a lot to do with Elixir or Erlang, and is only really tangentially related to computers, although it is related to computers. This talk is part of a series called Living Things, and this one is about language. I am actually designing a programming language right now, and this is not the big reveal for it. It is not ready for that yet. But I've been fascinated by the process of designing it, fascinated and terrified, because in some sense, it's completely free. It could become anything. It is the endeavor most like pure math that I think I've ever done. I'm venturing out into this world of concepts, just walking into a foreign land and then drawing up borders like I'm British or something. And in that sense, it's all very, very arbitrary. But in another important sense, it's not arbitrary at all. There are some shapes, some borders that are clearly wrong. And there are some that are clearly right. Fewer of those, many fewer of those, irritatingly, but they are there. And it's like there's something that this language wants to be. It's taking shape, and in a way, it's taking its own shape. We've all heard that languages are living things, and I think we treat that as metaphor. Languages that are spoken by people today, we call those alive. Languages that aren't spoken or are only spoken by a few crusty, dusty academics, those are dead. For the next 30 minutes, I want you to think about language as a living thing as literally as possible. And hopefully, I'll do a little bit to convince you of it. Languages don't breathe, they don't metabolize, but they do shape the worlds of their speakers. They reproduce, they consume resources, they come into equilibria with their environments which necessarily include us and our bodies and our minds. Language is powerful. Ancient and contemporary magical systems rely on the power of names. The names we give to things in our world kind of create that world. We say that the hardest problem in computer science is giving names to things. And that's because names matter. Names are connected into this mesh of meanings, linked into a web of implications that can fish out from our subconscious everything from machine schematics to childhood trauma. Language also has this reputation for being airy, something disconnected from the physical, disconnected from our bodies. Shh, your lover might say. No talking now. Now we dance. But I think this reputation conceals a vital truth, which is that language is a thing of the body. Our bodies have been made for language, for sign, for speech, for song. And language is a thing that grows out of our bodies, is rooted in our movement, and has evolved with us. It's as much a part of our bodies as our thumbs or our frontal cortex, or as dance. And so right now, I want you to remember that you have a body. Remember your lungs peeling open to draw in air so that the hemoglobin inside them can release CO2 and trap oxygen. You are alive, and so you are made up of living things. Remember the cells of your body. Remember the fibers of your muscles. Remember your heart squeezing and squishing your blood around to drive oxidization in your cells. And remember that oxidization is burning, and so inside of you are 37 trillion tiny fires. Remember the crackling of depolarizing membranes in your brain, nervous system strobing with information. You are alive, and so you are a part of living things. You are a cell within tissues that are shaped like cities and families and nations. You are alive, and so you have come from living things. Remember your ancestors. Remember the story that has brought you here. Remember your past. And remember about 10 years ago. Remember 10 years ago? 10 years ago, we were creating a new kind of media. It was distributed, it was disintermediated, it was networked, socially networked, made by us, consumed by us. Bloggers and tweeters sharing their worlds with each other. All of us would be creators, and all of us would be consumers. No longer would we be beholden to newspapers or reporters. No longer would we get our stories filtered through layers of intermediaries, each one spinning and slanting. No, we would just get the truth. The truth would win. And there were some naysayers, some negative Nancys, these like journalists and researchers asking, how will that work exactly? Like, how can you trust these faceless, maybe people who are veiled by layers of cable and protocol? And our response, or I should say my response, the one I said on the inside was, be fine, probably. Something, web of trust, wisdom of crowds. Look, this was the time of the Arab Spring, of social media catalyzed revolutions. Barack Hussein Obama had just been elected because of us. Global warming was happening and bad, but we were gonna fix it because we are powerful. We've been weaving ourselves a new culture, connecting in a new way, richer, more direct, organic. We were becoming something, all of us together, becoming something greater than any of us. And it seemed that we had been struck by lightning, and far from killing us, it gave us life, and our mycelium was bearing fruit. This is why we built everything. Remember that feeling? The promise of the internet, of cyberspace, of a new kind of space without nations and borders, a place where authoritarians would fear to tread, a place where their iron fists could punch only masks, where their walls could not be built because the network would perceive their censorship as damage and route around it, where we could rely on each other, on consensus, on the wisdom of the mob, a place where every story could be told, true or not, a place where your footprints could follow you forever, a place where you could be yourself, and so can anyone else, a place where everyone can find their people and dance in 1488 time, a place where new minds are growing and they're sprouting eyes everywhere and their hands are everywhere and they're learning from us how to be human, and so far they can reliably emulate three things: how to see, how to want, and how to lie. So in retrospect, those journalists and researchers, like everyone who was concerned or maybe alarmed about what would happen in a world with amplification but no accountability, they had a solid point there. It was a very solid point. Good job, Cassandra. We probably should have listened. Yeah, but we didn't. And now we're all completely fucked. Maybe. It does feel that way sometimes. I believe we will thrive. I believe life will thrive. I believe we will touch the stars. I believe we will grow cities from trees. I believe we will create space for all living things. Somehow, I believe in us, but we really don't make it easy. I mean, Uncle Sam has always been a little bit of a crotchety old racist, and he's really not looking so good these days. It's not just him. There's a lot of scary things happening all over the world. And if you told me 10 years ago that this was gonna happen, I don't know if I would have believed you. In fact, I'm not super sure I believe it now because I get a lot of my news from Twitter. And what's the saying? Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after, which does make sense. We should really expect that. There are many, many things that can go wrong in communication. So it's kind of a miracle we're able to communicate anything at all, but we do, reliably-ish, repeatably, and across great distances, with this powerful new technology, a technology called language. There's a lot of theories about how language came to be. One theory, favored by Noam Chomsky, says that it arose suddenly, about 100,000 years ago, the result of a small number of mutations in a single individual, sometimes named Prometheus, that gave that person's brain the ability to process what Chomsky calls digital infinity. This powerful capacity spread like a seed crystal in the early human mind, opening up the capacity for language and modern human cognition. You may know it by its other name, recursion. We all love recursion, I think. In this story, the recursive streams open, but they never close. That's the joke. That's what makes it kind of tingly to experience. You have this real sense of infinity, of this capacity within ourselves to begin in each moment a new story, each one embedded within the last. Of course, more common phrases also feature recursive embedding. All human languages contain the ability to expand their phrases indefinitely. Here, we can keep expanding this noun phrase by adding complementizers, which themselves contain noun phrases, creating this recursive embedding that allows for the possibility of an infinitely long sentence built through the recursive application of a finite number of rules. Digital infinity. It's this feature of language that allows us to define a landscape, an unbounded conceptual space in many dimensions. Language is an instinctive articulation of the math that has been embedded by billions of years of evolution into our squishy personal neural networks. In his book, The Recursive Mind, Michael Corballis theorizes that it's this capacity for recursion that distinguishes human thought from the cognitive processes of animals. Corballis, in fact, identifies a magic number, 3. 3 layers. 3 stack frames, if you will, seem to be about the number of recursive layers that humans can comfortably hold at once, which is enough. 1 stack frame gives you a moment, gives you the now. 2 gives you a delta, a direction. But if you're able to hold 3 stack frames, you can hold the past, the present, and the future, this temporal triumvirate that's nearly universal in human experience, represented in the tenses of almost every language. With 3 stack frames, you get direction and meta-direction, which gives you story. And that's what we are. We are stories telling ourselves. We're all familiar with it, that little voice inside our head that speaks in our voice. It's our inner narrative. And it turns out it's not entirely inner. Our inner voice is part of a system in our brain called the phonological loop, part of Badley and Hitch's model of working memory. When you read the words on this diagram, you hear them. Prefrontal cortex, attention controller. And it turns out you hear them because you are actually saying them, almost, kind of. You're saying them very quietly, without any vocal oomph. You're sub-vocalizing. Your brain is actually sending to your body a softer shadow of the motor impulses that would cause you to speak the words. For sign language users, those motor impulses go to the arms and the hands and the face. For speaking people, they go to the tongue and larynx. Echoes of these impulses then return to the brain, so you feel a little bit like you're actually hearing speech or seeing sign gestures. These sensations can then be processed by the same mechanisms we use to process the words that anyone else says to us. Reading the written word is this type coercion operation. We need to convert pictures of words into a stream of word meanings, these word embeddings in the vector space of language within our brain. And since we already have a way to do that for phonological information we receive, our brain just uses that. This process also gives longevity to the words that we're trying to hold in our head. The Badley model holds that there is basically no storage for words that exists purely within the brain. We have a short-term phonological store, but information held there is going to decay very quickly unless it's committed to long-term memory or refreshed. Refreshing our word buffer is where the loop part of the phonological loop comes in. If we want to hold some piece of information in our minds, linguistic information particularly, we need to refresh our phonological store through rehearsal, which you are familiar with because you have definitely done it. It's what you're doing when you mutter a phone number to yourself over and over again, 8675309, 8675309. You're trying to keep the memory of it from decaying. It even kind of feels like that. You're bouncing the pattern of words off of your body so you can perceive them again and refresh your memory. And this, it turns out, is how our brains store words in working memory, by using our bodies as buffers. Sub-vocalization is particularly noticeable in kids because it's often not that sub. I remember watching my niece play when she was younger. She would narrate what she was doing, often to no one in particular. And that's pretty normal. Early in the language acquisition phase, you'll often find kids narrating their inner speech out loud or by explicitly signing it, before they learn how to suppress that and develop sub-vocalization. It's the same thing with reading. We mostly learn to read by reading aloud, and traces of that fact never really go away. In fact, one of the pieces of evidence for sublocalization comes from reading comprehension. If you make people hold their tongues against the roofs of their mouths while they're reading a passage, they show poorer comprehension of what they just read versus people who got to do some unrelatedly annoying motor task, like tapping their fingers. Pinning the tongue literally pins your inner tongue, muffling your inner voice, which is almost a bizarrely prosaic explanation for something that seems so intimate, our inner voice. If that's happening, it seems like we could surely detect it and even do some kind of speech recognition on it, which we can. This is Arnav Kapoor. He's at MIT, and he's built a proof-of-concept silent computing platform which uses speech recognition via electromycography, that is, reading the electrical impulses sent to the muscles of your jaw and larynx. Using this input, the system is able to do speech recognition and read the words that you are saying in your head. And then it can also reply to you via bone transduction. The purpose of this is to create a silent computing platform, something that can function as what he calls an intelligence augmentation device. It recognizes the question that you're asking in your head, asks Google, and then answers by vibrating the bones in your jaw. This diagram identifies some key brain areas that have been shaped by language. So here we see the phonological loop located in Broca and Wernicke's area, areas of the cortex commonly associated with language processing. There's a growing body of evidence that there's another part of the brain that's quite important for language as well, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is pretty special. It contains half of the neurons in our nervous system. All action commands from the brain to body route through it, and all sensations from the body to the brain as well. It's vitally important for motor coordination, like this. People with cerebellar damage have some difficulty performing that action smoothly. With cerebellar damage, our movements become jerky and laggy. It's theorized that the cerebellum acts as a Smith predictor, our brain's controller for our latency-distant bodies, able to estimate our body's current state from sensory feedback, integrate that feedback to update the model, and then decompose gross action commands generated elsewhere in the brain into a fine-tuned, continuously varying control signal. And once you've evolved it, a thing like that has many uses. Movement is this combination of a reduce operation and a serialization operation. So say you're trying to spear a bison. First, you need to know where the bison will be by the time you throw the spear. And so you take this stream of input from your senses and decode observations. Based on the patterns of light and dark hitting your retina, you recognize shapes and eventually creatures and movement and their gestures. And then you reduce that stream of bison gestures into a model for the creature. Where is it going to be at some future time t? So now you know where you need the spear to be. And now all you have to do is run that entire process kind of in reverse, creating a sequence of commands for your own movements that will deliver the spear to that point at that time t in the future. Then you cue the commands and throw the spear, and poor bison. And language, too, is this combination of reduction and serialization. When we are listening, we are reducing a sequence of words into a meaning, a model describing the movement of the speaker in cognitive space. And when we speak, we need to serialize our inner meaning, this point within a space of all experiences, into a sequence of words. With both language and movement, we're transforming coordinate spaces, translating from the state of our inner worlds, a point within some space of experience, into a sequence of moves that will move the listener to that point. Whether the point is cognitive or physical doesn't really matter. The math is the same. So language is dance, and dance is communication. I was just in Mexico, and one evening there, I had this fascinating experience of listening to some Mexican and Colombian people talking in Spanish about the differences between Colombian Spanish and Mexican Spanish. And I should tell you that my Spanish is pretty bad, so I didn't know all the words of this conversation. But I was able to follow it pretty much. And partially that's because they were literally explaining the meaning of words. But it's also because they were dancing around each other. I could feel them approaching meanings and circumscribing them and moving away, and it actually felt like that. It didn't matter that I didn't know all the words, because they were exploring this graph, kind of revealing the connections, revealing the topography of a cognitive landscape. The physicality of language shows up in other ways. It shows up in how we talk a lot, right? We take stances on issues. Yours might be to the left or right. When we've said too much, we walk back. When we walk back too often, we're flip-flopping or dancing around the issue. We move towards ideas we want to embody and distance ourselves from concepts we no longer like. And those are all metaphors. But I'd argue that our readiness to liken concepts to positionality suggests that they are processed very similarly in our brains. It's this newly evolved faculty of language relying on ancient circuits evolved to do the hardest thing in the world, move around in it. And all of this kind of suggests an origin for language that's rather different from the discontinuous origin suggested by Chomsky. There's some open questions with that story, after all. For one thing, even if the capability for language is a small enough set of mutations to have arisen spontaneously in one person, how did language arise? Language is a process of communication, so who did Prometheus talk to? For another, language has pretty deeply shaped our bodies. The human voice box is capable of incredible feats that no other animal can quite reproduce. Some birds do pretty well, but our primate cousins really don't. And so tell me, Mr. Anderson, what good is recursive grammar when you are unable to speak? Corballis and others have offered a solution, which is that language didn't arise with speech. It arose with gesture. The first languages they offer were sign languages. And that at least seems viable. We know of primates who can use sign language. And once sign language is established, there's some good reasons to transition slowly to the spoken word. For one thing, speech allows you to communicate over great distance when line of sight isn't available and when your hands are busy holding spears. Of course, the machinery doesn't have to change that much. We already use acoustic information to build up a physical model of our surroundings. And so tweaking how that information is integrated almost seems within the plasticity of an individual brain, to say nothing of the capacity for evolution to change the wiring of those brains. There are some other gradualist theories of the origin of language. Some folks say that language may have begun as grunts intended to synchronize manual labor, so heave and hoe. Others, and I love this theory, say that it began as baby talk or mama speak, the coos and babble between mothers and children that slowly gained semantics. And some people literally say it started as dance. I don't think we'll ever really be able to disentangle which of these theories actually happens. And I don't think it matters all that much. All of them speak to truths about our experience of language today, and they all sound plausible enough. We can see each one reflected in our experience, which has evolved substantially. We now have a profusion of languages spread across the globe. This tree, drawn by Mina Sundberg, just shows the old world languages from Europe and Asia. Most of those are descended from Proto-Indo-European, which is a language spoken by people in the Ural steppes about 6,000 years ago. And there are, of course, many more. There are other language families, and there were earlier languages that we have since forgotten. And it was those earlier languages that shaped our bodies, that gave us vocal cords, that shaped our minds, giving us stories, giving us narrative, that thread from which we weave our whole world. That's power, and it flows both ways. Language is this thing we made without even being fully cognizant of the fact that we were making it. It has shaped us and our bodies just as much as we have shaped it. Where does language exist? A particular language, the English language, where is it? It's a weird question. It almost throws a type error. But I think you can locate it. You can locate it in me. It's in me, it's this program running in my mind. But not just in mine. It's in yours, and yours, and his, and hers. It's a distributed program running on a biological strata, a concept that has been given tenancy on an infrastructure of many minds. And each one of us holds a shard. Language is organized into shards, just as we are organized into cells. The shards replicate. They are taught and they are learned. They adapt. The language that we learn is not exactly the language that we were taught. The language of youngs, rather famously, is not quite the language of olds. Biological systems, too, are made of self-replicating components, and because of this, they adapt and they grow. They come into homeostasis with their surroundings, and they are governed by laws of statistical mechanics, which guide them into shapes that can most effectively consume energy and dissipate it as heat. And language is also governed by those laws. As something broken into fragments, it too must evolve. Everything we build must evolve. Everything comes alive. Everything we make is going to join an ecosystem that includes us, that shapes us, that we become a part of, just as it becomes a part of us. So what we are doing, what all of us in this room are doing, is magic. It's the oldest magic. It's living things creating new living things transmuting ourselves, which is a great power. And with great power comes, you know, the rest. The thing about words is that once they're in you, you can't help but experience them. So you see these words, and you go somewhere quite nice, like Cancun. You don't have to do anything, and in fact, you can't really do anything. It just kind of happens. As creators and coders, I think we develop an intuitive understanding of this. We have these physicalized inner worlds that represent the abstract things we work with every day. So you see this, and maybe the triangle pops into your head. And you read this, and that taps into something visceral. The feeling of a tiny creature crawling in your skin. This compromise of bodily integrity. And I'm referring, of course, to Katie Hopkins, whose words are designed to get into you. You can't help but envision them, and in envisioning them, you can't help but form associations, and those associations are a spell. They are a power being enacted on your mind. This is a security hole in our brains, a security hole that is currently being exploited with alarming efficiency. The exploits are not themselves new, but we are giving them powerful new vectors as we open more and more avenues for communication, which is the unfortunate downside of a connected world. Everything spreads. But don't be afraid. My purpose here is not to strike fear into your heart. It's to help you remember something that you already know. We are all magicians. We, the living things of Earth, have created this world. We have created its joys and its sorrows, and we have within us this incredible power to heal and shape and to create things beyond our control, things that may live far longer than we do. And we could really, really screw things up. And we definitely will. But I think we will also plant seeds that are going to grow into something new, into new kinds of life, and into futures we cannot yet imagine. Thank you.